From space, Africa looks like one enormous solid landmass. It seems whole, a continent united by its sheer size, stretching from the Mediterranean Sea down to the cold waters of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. You can see its familiar shape, a giant question mark on the globe, and it gives the impression of a single, connected place. This view, however, is a grand illusion. It hides the deep divisions carved into the land by nature itself. What appears unified from orbit is, on the ground, a collection of vastly different worlds, separated by some of the most formidable barriers on Earth. This geographic reality has shaped the destiny of its people for millennia, making unity and easy movement a constant struggle rather than a given. This immense continent is not one place but many. To understand it, you must see its major regions as almost separate entities. In the north, the Sahara Desert, the largest hot desert in the world, acts as a massive barrier, a sea of sand bigger than the entire United States. It separates North Africa from the rest of the continent, creating two distinct cultural and historical zones. Just south of this great desert lies the Sahel, a semi-arid belt of land that stretches from east to west. It is a transition zone, a fragile frontier between the sands of the Sahara and the more fertile savannas further south. Life here is tough, dictated by unpredictable rains and the ever-present threat of the desert expanding. Further south still, you find the Congo Basin, home to the world's second-largest rainforest. This is a dense, humid, and often impenetrable jungle, fed by the mighty Congo River. It is a world of its own, rich in resources, but incredibly difficult to cross or develop. The thick vegetation and challenging terrain have historically isolated the communities living within it. To the east, the continent is literally tearing itself apart along the Great Rift Valley. This massive geological trench runs for thousands of kilometers, creating a dramatic landscape of deep valleys, towering volcanoes, and long, narrow lakes. It is a stunning feature but also another powerful divider, fragmenting the eastern part of the continent. These major geographic zones are not just features on a map, they are forces that have shaped everything. They have dictated where people could live, what they could farm, and who they could trade with. The Sahara cut off easy overland contact between the peoples of the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa for centuries. The Congo Basin acted as a green wall, limiting the expansion of kingdoms and the movement of people. The Great Rift Valley created natural boundaries that kept communities apart. This fragmentation is the first clue to understanding why Africa, despite its size and appearance of unity, has always been a continent of contrasts and deep-seated challenges to connection. Most of Africa is a massive plateau, a high, flat tableland that drops sharply at the coasts. This elevation creates a fundamental problem for travel and trade. The continent's great rivers like the Nile, the Congo, the Niger, and the Zambezi have to tumble down from this high plateau to reach the sea. This creates spectacular waterfalls and rapids such as Victoria Falls or the cataracts of the Nile. While beautiful, these features make the rivers largely unnavigable for long distances. Unlike Europe's Rhine or North America's Mississippi, you cannot simply sail a boat from deep within Africa's interior all the way to the coast. The rivers are broken into sections, preventing them from being the great commercial highways they are on other continents. This rugged terrain meant that for most of history, people lived in relative isolation. A community might be just 100 kilometers from another, but separated by a steep escarpment, a dense forest, or an uncrossable river. This isolation fostered incredible diversity. With little regular contact between groups, thousands of different languages and cultures developed. Each small region had its own traditions, its own social structures, and its own way of life, protected and preserved by the very geography that kept them apart. This cultural richness is one of Africa's great treasures, but it also made creating large, unified political states incredibly difficult. The land itself resisted the formation of empires built on easy communication and trade. The coastline of Africa added another layer of difficulty. The continent has a remarkably smooth coastline with very few natural deep water harbors. Unlike Europe, with its many bays, inlets, and protective fjords, much of Africa's coast is straight and exposed. This made it difficult for large seafaring ships to find safe anchorage. For centuries, this limited maritime trade with the outside world. While Arab dhows traded along the east coast and European ships later arrived on the west, they could not easily establish the kind of vast, interconnected port systems that drove commerce elsewhere. The continent was, in a sense, turning its back to the sea, its wealth and people locked behind coastal escarpments and unnavigable rivers. This combination of high plateaus, broken rivers, and a smooth coastline created a perfect storm for disconnection. Trade routes were difficult and dangerous, often relying on human porters or pack animals to traverse the tough landscape. Moving goods from the interior to the coast, or even between neighboring regions, was a slow and expensive process. A farmer in the highlands of Ethiopia, for example, had little chance of selling his crops in a market in West Africa. The continent was a patchwork of small local economies, unable to easily connect and create the larger markets that generate widespread wealth. Geography had dealt Africa a difficult hand, making internal unity and external trade a constant battle against the land itself. When European powers arrived to colonize Africa in the late 19th century, they were not interested in the continent's natural or ethnic divisions. They saw Africa as a cake to be sliced up. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, they drew lines on a map with rulers, creating borders that served their own economic and political interests. These new boundaries paid no attention to the realities on the ground. They cut straight through the territories of established kingdoms, split ethnic groups into different colonies, and forced rival communities together into a single administrative unit. The geography that had separated people for thousands of years was ignored, and the cultural maps of the continent were torn apart and redrawn. This colonial map-making created a legacy of conflict and instability that persists to this day. For example, the Somali people, who share a common language, culture, and religion, were split between British, Italian, and French colonies, as well as Ethiopia. This division has been a source of conflict ever since. Elsewhere, historic enemies were bundled together into a single country, like in Nigeria, where hugely diverse groups from the north and south were forced to coexist under one flag. These artificial states lacked a shared identity or history, making the task of nation-building almost impossible. The borders were not just lines on a map. They were scars that created permanent tension. The infrastructure built during the colonial period was not designed to connect Africa with itself. Instead, it was designed to extract resources. Railways and roads were built for one purpose: to get raw materials like copper, cocoa, or diamonds from the interior to a port, where they could be shipped to Europe. A railway might run from a mine in the highlands directly to the coast, but it would not connect with a neighboring country's railway. This created a system where it was often easier to travel or trade with London or Paris than with a city in the next country. The continent's transport networks were like spokes on a wheel, all pointing outwards to the sea with no rim to connect them. After independence, African nations were left with these illogical borders and disconnected infrastructure. The new leaders had to try and build a sense of national unity within boundaries that made little sense. The challenge was immense. How do you govern a country where people on one side of a border have more in common with those in a neighboring nation than with their own countrymen? How do you build a national economy when the roads and railways are designed only for export? The colonial era locked Africa into a geographic and political trap, making the already difficult task of overcoming its natural divisions even harder. The legacy of these artificial lines continues to shape the continent's struggles. Today, the consequences of Africa's geography, compounded by its colonial history, are starkly visible. One of the most significant problems is the high number of landlocked countries. 16 nations in Africa have no direct access to the sea. This is a severe economic handicap. Countries like Uganda, Ethiopia, and Chad must rely on their neighbors for access to ports. They have to transport their goods across foreign territory, paying high transit fees and dealing with potential political instability or customs delays. This makes their exports more expensive and their imports harder to get, trapping them in a cycle of dependency and slowing their economic growth. They are, quite literally, prisoners of their geography. The lack of internal connections remains a massive obstacle. Even within a single country, moving goods and people can be a nightmare. In a city like Lagos, Nigeria, or Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the roads are often overwhelmed, leading to gridlock that can paralyze the economy. Outside the major cities, the infrastructure is often poor or non-existent. Paved roads may give way to dirt tracks that become impassable during the rainy season. Rivers, still lacking navigable channels, are barriers rather than highways. This makes it incredibly difficult to create a single, unified national market. A farmer in a remote village may struggle to get their produce to a city just a few hundred kilometers away, leading to waste and lost income. This internal fragmentation stands in stark contrast to Africa's connections with the rest of the world. It is often cheaper and faster to ship a container from China to the port of Mombasa in Kenya than it is to transport that same container by road from Mombasa to neighboring Uganda. The old colonial patterns of trade persist. Africa's economies are still largely oriented towards exporting raw materials to foreign markets and importing finished goods. Trade between African countries themselves is remarkably low compared to other continents. The geographic and infrastructural barriers mean that it is simply easier to do business with Europe or Asia than with the country next door. Despite these immense challenges, Africa's potential is undeniable. The continent is rich in resources, has the world's youngest population, and is home to some of the fastest-growing economies. There are major projects underway to build new highways, railways, and digital infrastructure to finally connect the continent. However, the fundamental challenge remains. Africa's sheer scale and its difficult dividing geography are powerful forces that cannot be easily overcome. The promise of the continent is vast, but its progress will always be linked to the struggle of bridging the vast distances and formidable barriers that have kept its people apart for so long. The land itself remains the biggest hurdle.